Don't fool yourself. Community is going to be the most important thing if we ever find ourselves in a widespread emergency or outright collapse. I do have a predilection for communication technology. And ham radio, after all, is the original hackable and open source community. It hits on several other of my favorite things too, like practical science and defending freedom and the very ideals of the Constitution. As a side note, I will be using ham radio here interchangeably with amateur radio. The ham in ham radio refers to the first spark gap operators, and that they were ham-fisted as a way of talking about a telegraph. So we're specifically referring to an organization that is not directly connected to any commercial or government activities. If you're not familiar with amateur radio in the United States, it has been around formally since 1912. This is when a license was first required to operate legally within the United States. These privileges are now governed by the Federal Communications Commission, who manages the radio spectrum so that the government, commercial, and citizens don't step all over each other. While I am sure that the very mention of the federal government for most of my audience would generally make you roll your eyes, I do personally think that this is a practical and good use of the federal government. The radio spectrum, you see, is a very powerful technology. It can be used to communicate across not only all the corners of this great United States, but also the world. Commercial interests are not always after the common good, and personally, I don't want to disrupt our warriors and first responders' ability to conduct operations. So something brokering these resources at a national and international level feels reasonable to me, because we're all using this natural resource, the radio spectrum. I see the ability for citizens to be allowed to maintain infrastructure, skills, and services for the common good. This is the practical exercising of our constitutional rights. The First Amendment, freedom of speech and right to assemble. In the 21st century, the right to assemble and free speech should not be confined to a person-to-person contact situation. It should include the ability to establish networks and communication means without being impeded by commercial or governmental interference. For example, I should not have to go to the government or commercial entity in order to have long-distance communication, like a cell phone company or a telephone company. I should be able to do that myself. The Second Amendment. I've tied this in with that too. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Yep, that's right. Amateur radio is both like a signal corps for militia, and since knowledge is power and communication of that knowledge is a weapon, I am going to tie the ability to communicate to the right to bear arms. In this regards, my HF radios are just as important as any assault rifle, and my handheld radio is my sidearm. Your ability to coordinate in a disaster or in a militia, or just in general as a free citizen, is enabled by these technologies, right? But they don't, just like the right to bearing arms, and training with those arms is only maintained by actually having them, by actually physically, having them obtained in times of peace, right? When it's not a time of need, conflict, emergency, you need to have those things in a normal time when there's nothing going wrong. So goes with holding the equipment that enables communications without reliance on commercial or government interests. if you would not wait to buy a gun until disaster strikes, then you wouldn't want to wait to figure out how to communicate either. Now that you've heard my perspective, let's look at what the FCC acknowledges in its Part 97 rules regarding amateur radio services. Okay, so this is Part 97. And I'm just going to run through this really quick. So they recognize that amateurs enhance the value of the amateur service as a voluntary, non-commercial communication service, particularly with respect to providing emergency communications. So that's A. B, continuation and extension of the amateur's proven ability to contribute to the advancement of the radio art. That's right, a lot of inventions and things like that have come from the experimentation that amateur radio operators have done. Encouragement and improvement of the amateur service through rules which provide for advancing skills in both the communication and technical phases of the art, because there is the operational aspect, the operational procedures of good communication, and then there is, of course, the technology aspect. And this provisions foster for both operations and technology. D, expansion of the existing reservoir within the within the amateur radio service of trained operators, technicians, and electronics experts. So they want to maintain that pool of talent. E, continuation and extension of the amateur's unique ability to enhance international goodwill. So it was recognized by the federal government, and it has been over and over again if you start looking at different stories, particularly around the Cold War. But amateur radio operators talk to folks in other countries, and sometimes those other countries are not free or are not so free to speak. There is a lot of different international kind of rules, but in general, by us being able to talk uncensored to people in other countries, we extend goodwill. Hopefully, that we're not a bunch of jerks. So in conclusion, what we have with ham radio is freedom to communicate and experiment, to be prepared for emergencies without reliance on the federal government or trusting any particular corporation. They even acknowledge that it is our superpower to do so, whether those emergencies are God or man-made.